Good day, folks. We're going on with Hebrews chapter 11 from verse 17, and then maybe just a number of just encouraging things, maybe right up to verse 28 for today. All right. So two guys that really encourages us to stay with our faith in God. I spoke about Abraham yesterday. I want to go a little bit back to Abraham and then go into Moses, the life of Moses. But here's an interesting thing, and I just touched on it yesterday as well. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him. Now that is something you need to think. God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. And you know what? Here God gives you a promise, and then God tells you, give it back to me. Or go and sacrifice it. I mean, that's a test, isn't it? My only son, God. The only little bit of money that I've got. The only property that I've got. God says, you go and be willing to sacrifice it. Be willing to give it up. Here's a test God put. And here's an interesting thing. It says, even through Isaac, your offspring would be reckoned, and he had this in his mind. He's taking his son right up to the mountain. He says, but God, you told me through my offspring, I'm an old man, I'm probably never going to have another child here. And he says, but Abram reasoned that God could raise the dead. I like that in the middle of here. So he's taking his son to the mountain, willing to sacrifice him, and think, but God is big enough that if he wants me to kill my son, he could, if he wants to raise him from the dead as well. He did receive Isaac back from the dead in a sense, because he was willing to offer him. That's what the Bible says, and get him back. Okay, so then we go with the faith of Isaac, the faith of Jacob, the faith of Joseph. Joseph, another interesting. Let me quickly touch on that before I get to Moses. Now, Joseph was in Egypt. He died in Egypt, and he says, listen, I believe that God, I'm using Rudolph's paraphrase, I believe that God is going to free us as Israelites, so don't just throw my bones away. Bury them, and when God, and it happened only many years later, when God set us free, please take my bones with you to the promised land. You see, that's the faith of Joseph. People were in dire straits, and he says, don't throw my bones away, because we're going to be delivered and we're going to take them with us. Then it comes to Moses. Man, I love the life of Moses. First of all, his mother's faith in verse 23. His mother looked at this little boy. Now, I know most of us look at our children and think they're very special. But Moses says Moses' mommy thought this was no ordinary child. Something was going to happen through him. So Moses was kept by his mommy, put in this basket and on the Nile River. And then later it says in verse 26, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead for his reward. Now you got to go to the Old Testament, and you also go to the book of Acts here, and you see here that Moses was living like an Egyptian, in the presence of Pharaoh, in the palace with all the riches and all the glory. And he says, I would rather view that as a disgrace. I'm not going to concentrate on the treasures of Egypt. I will go. And then he went back to his own people while they were still under the Egyptian rulers. And it says here that he went and he mixed with them. He knew his inheritance. He knew who was his own people. And then by faith, he trusted God. I'm sure that there was something inside Moses already that God needed to do an act of redemption, a work of redemption in the life of the Israelites. He says, but when he was 40 years old, Acts chapter 7:23, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, he chose rather the path of affliction, the path of rejection, the path of running away from those riches, the path of going back to the people of Israel to be called and to enjoy the pleasures of passing sin. You see, here's an example of Moses. He could have stayed in that palace and have everything his heart's desire. Food, whatever his heart's desire could have had. And he was willing to give that up by faith to identify with God and God's people. That's a great example. We'll come to another couple of examples tomorrow as well. Father, thank you for the example of Abraham, Joseph, Moses in this chapter. that encourage us by faith not to give up and not to look for temporary things, pleasures of this world, riches of this world, buildings and other stuff, but by faith to follow the example of Abraham, Moses, and others that chose the higher road, the road of walking with you in closeness. Help us today to do whatever we need to do to walk by faith. In Jesus' name.